Well, first, I too want to thank Dr. Marsh for coming to Texas A&M and presenting his fascinating work on a fascinating film and actually whole filmmaking body. The films by the collective preceded López Carrasco's Futuro, which he talks about in more depth. And with the clips that you saw here, you finally, I think in the final clip that he shows, get a sense of just kind of how unnerving the film finally becomes at the end. I hadn't seen the film before, just the other day when I looked at it in preparation for my remarks right now. And for the first 15 minutes or so, I was talking to Andy about this. I was just kind of thinking, oh brother, it's another one of those, you know, kind of fly on the wall film about kind of ordinary, everyday behavior by a group of people. I have to kind of confess that I've never really been able to get into the kind of Andy Warhol aesthetic that, as Dr. Marsh points out, a film like this in part is responding to. But at some point in the film, maybe 20, 25 minutes into it, it does become very kind of gripping and unnerving to me in a way that is alluded to by one of the statements that Dr. Marsh made when he talks about again, the fact that this film, which when you look at it, could easily pass for something made in the past and not a contemporary film from just last year. But he says, though it could be confused with the period piece genre, films made in the present or made at a certain time but set in the past, none of the nostalgia that inundated Spanish screens, and particularly the country's television screens throughout the 1990s and 2000s, in which recreation of the past was reduced to temporal disjuncture, deprived of its uncanniness. And that's the only time he uses the term uncanniness or the uncanny in this paper, I think. And if that stuck out to me, maybe in part because of a seminar I'm teaching right now that Michela's in, where we've been talking about the concept of the uncanny all week. And perhaps because of that, but I don't think only because of that, I was struck by just how strong the concept of the uncanny seems to be in this work and in El Futuro. And indeed, I think that that Dr. Marsh's work delineates a practice, delineates the cinematic practice that articulates the connection between both cinema and the uncanny on the one hand, and the politics of history and the practice of deconstruction on the other hand, in a way that productively connects all four. We all, I think, have a pretty good kind of working definition of what's uncanny. It's a term that is used a lot in theoretical discussions, but I think you could probably talk to most high school graduates who have an idea of something that just strikes them as uncanny. Something that is both kind of deeply personal and alien, something that seems connected to one's kind of deepest, darkest secret self, but also profoundly alien and other and mysterious. And people like Jacques Derrida, Dr. Marsh has talked about and quoted from in his paper, have connected the concept of uncanniness to their own work in the discipline of deconstruction, or the practice of criticizing texts in a way that unmasks their operations and in some sense kind of shows that the deeper you look into something, the more you find that it's not only saying what it's ostensibly and straightforwardly presenting itself as saying, but also in some ways saying the exact opposite of what you think it's saying. And I think that that's all key in a way to my appreciation of this work as Dr. Marsh has presented it here. He talks about how this filmmaking practice of alludes to Victor Enrique and Pedro Almodovar, among other Spanish filmmakers. And not being that expert on Spanish cinema of the 70s and 80s, I nonetheless kind of noticed that, you know, there's seems to be an affinity between something like this and what in some ways seems very dissimilar in the work of Pedro Almodovar and Victor Enrique with films like Spirit of the Beehive. An affiliation that is tellingly asymmetrical in Dr. Marsh's words, expressed as a conjuration, as both a raising of the dead and as an exorcism. And you see in that wording right there that there's a sense of kind of paired opposites, you know, things that you wouldn't think would go together, but that at some other level you realize do kind of go together. A raising of the dead and an exorcism, you know, a casting out of a spirit and a bringing of a spirit into the room, so to speak. The way in which a film like this operates and the way in which Dr. Marsh analyzes it is incredibly rich in these kind of evocative contradictions. The fact that the film was shot on 16 millimeter and clearly shows it, but which is, as I'm sure the filmmakers must have realized when they made it, would probably be seen by the vast majority of people in some sort of digital format. You know, so there's a sense of loss and contradiction there when you're watching something that conveys the materiality of film, but that, you know, we're all watching on, you know, at best a DVD or a Blu-ray, and at worst on some sort of online presentation via a Vimeo account or something. And I think even if one were to be privileged enough to see the film at a film festival on 16 millimeter, you know, we're now at a point in cinematic history when if we see something projected that way, we realize we're a part of some sort of privileged event that we'll probably never have the opportunity to revisit in quite that same way again. This will be the only time we'll ever see this 16 millimeter film on 16 millimeter. The very presentation of it further evokes the constitutional or constitutive sense of loss that film scholars have always argued the cinema brings with it. And again, in that way, I think these films and Dr. Marsh's analyses of them further underline the very connection between cinema and the uncanny. Also think that ultimately Dr. Marsh's criticism of this film does maybe a little bit indirectly point to the important political value of work like this. You know, sometimes my students, admittedly, even me myself, you know, have a hard time translating the kind of high theoretical discourse like this into concrete political terms. What does this mean for me politically today? But I think that the way in which work like this articulates the presence of loss, not just in Spanish society, but in virtually any kind of political society. The future of the past, or the history of the future, to look at it another way, as well as the anxiety of sociability and the unbearable lightness of overwhelmingly heavy legacies of the past, like fascism, do point the way towards political discourse that I think is very valuable in concrete ways. So kind of just throwing all that out there at you. I guess we'll turn the time over to Michela.
Thank you.